My girlfriend is always comparing me to her ex-boyfriend. So I've been with my girlfriend Chloe for the last 2 years. We're in a really happy relationship, and I've even considered marrying her in the near future. The only issue I have with her is that she's constantly comparing me to her ex-boyfriend Mark. It is really annoying, and it is starting to hurt my feelings. If I ever do something wrong, then she would always point out that Mark wouldn't have made the same mistake. I know that they were childhood sweethearts and were together for over 10 years, but I really think she needs to stop doing this. She always gives me the silent treatment afterwards when I ask her to stop, which always makes me feel like I did something wrong. It is really starting to get on my nerves, so I decided to organize a meeting between the three of us and let her choose which one she wants. I knew she would be home late on Sunday evening, so I decided that was the perfect day for the meeting. Me and Mark were sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in. I could see the look of shock on her face when she saw him. She fainted on the ground, and I knew that she wanted Mark. I decided I would stand aside and let them be together. I placed Mark's rotting corpse back into his grave and then carefully lowered Chloe on top of him before closing the coffin. I started throwing the dirt on top of the grave so that no one would ever know that it was disturbed. I could hear Chloe's screams of what I assume were joy as she was finally reunited with the love of her life. I felt horrible that we were breaking up, but I didn't want to stand in the way of true love. My son's voice doesn't echo. My son's voice doesn't echo. It's true, his voice doesn't have an echo. He was around 4 years old when we noticed it. We had been at the park playing, and on our way home we passed through a tunnel. I've always found echoes very funny, so I shouted, "Yabba dabba doo!" really loud. It bounced back right away. It made my son giggle. He shouted something, but it didn't bounce back. It was all flat. I looked at my wife. She didn't seem to notice. "Come on, buddy, try again, louder," I said to him. So he did, but it made no difference. His voice didn't echo. I found it quite odd, but we didn't talk about it. That night, my wife locked herself in the bathroom for hours. I could hear her sobbing in there, but she wouldn't let me in. The years passed, and my wife decided to homeschool our son, since she was a teacher, and I didn't argue with her on that. "Other kids can be so cruel," she said when we discussed different educational options. "I know what's best for him." Our son didn't have any friends, and my wife was sort of overprotective of him. He only spent time with us. He was an only child, and me and my wife had a difficult time conceiving, leading us in on IVF treatments. After some excruciating months, we finally found out that she was pregnant. 9 months later, he was born. It wasn't just that his voice didn't echo that made him different. One night, when we practiced his reading skills, I started making shadow figures on the wall. I made various animals, and my son thought it was hilarious. He wanted to try as well, and I helped form his grip into a moose figure, and he placed his hands in front of the lamp, and I gasped. Nothing. My son didn't have a shadow. This couldn't be real. I knocked on the bathroom door to tell my wife my latest discovery, and she was in there again. She had been crying a while ago, just like every other night the past years. Now all I hear was silence. I called her, asked if everything was okay. No answer. I got up and grabbed the screwdriver. After minutes of struggle, I finally managed to get the door open. I found my wife, laying in our bathtub. The water was dyed red from her cuts. Beside her laid a little note. It said, "To my husband, forgive me. I can't continue living this lie. Our son is dead. He died of cancer when he was 2. Your doctors told me it was your way of coping with the loss of him, and that it would go away. But it never did. You still believe that he exists. It breaks my heart to pretend that he's with us every day. I can't live like this anymore. I'm sorry." The Old Man in the Well. Keith was 12 the first time the old man in the well spoke to him. Keith was out playing after dark on the family's small farm near the well. The old well had beams supporting a rope and pulley with a bucket attached, even though Keith was told that the well ran dry before he was born. Suddenly, he heard someone say his name in a low, raspy voice.
Keith.
Keith whirled around and saw no one. A look of confusion spread across his face as he heard it again.
Keith.
This time it was said with more force and a bit louder.
Keith.
The voice sounded like one of those old farmers who liked to smoke, thought Keith. Looking down the well, Keith heard the same voice asking,
Have you got anything tasty?
Keith couldn't see anything past the first 12 or so feet down the well, even though it was a full moon. Who are you? How'd you get down there? Keith asked.
If you give me something tasty, I'll reward you,
replied the voice. All Keith had were some cookies he had stuffed into his pockets before he left to play. He put those in the bucket and lowered it. He had lowered it nearly 40 feet, and it was literally at the end of the rope when he could no longer feel the weight of the bucket on the rope. 20 seconds passed, and he felt the weight of the bucket again, and began to pull it up. As he finished pulling the bucket up to the top, he heard the voice say,
No nice.
Keith saw a reflection in the bucket and saw a rectangular piece of silver metal, about the size of an army dog tag. It was completely flat and smooth.
Want fresh,
the voice said. Even though Keith tried to talk to the old man again, there was no response. Keith made up a story about where he found the metal and took it to his father, who took it to the town and confirmed that it was an ounce of pure silver. After that, Keith kept it a secret. It took a while to discover the old man was only there the night of full moons. Keith quickly learned that only live things he put in the well would be rewarded, but only once for each item and once per full moon. So, one of each kind of animal was lowered down into the well and rewarded. Keith now had a cigar box mostly full of silver pieces by the time he was 16, but had run out of different animals to get rewarded for. It was around the time that the local farmhand went missing. It was also the same time that Keith was rewarded with gold pieces for the first time. Once Keith took over the farm, temp workers seemed to vanish every now and then without explanation from the farm. The old man had finally found something tasty enough to always reward. He didn't have a warrant.
LAPD, open up.
I'd fallen asleep on the couch again. I didn't appreciate the sudden interruption, and I doubly didn't appreciate the first 4 letters it began with. Even though I didn't remember doing anything wrong, cops still filled me with dread. I staggered to the door and unlocked it. There he was, one cop, tall, thin, pale, and blonde. Can I help you, officer?
We're looking for a suspect in the neighborhood. May I come in?
I blinked. The suspect isn't in here, I said.
I didn't imply they were. I'd just like to ask you some questions.
You can ask from here. He sighed and pulled out a notepad and pen. He asked what I'd been doing for the last 2 hours, and I told him I'd drifted off while watching some horror movie, and I was fast asleep when he pounded on my door.
You're sure you didn't see anything at all?
Positive. He fidgeted, staring past me into my apartment.
I'd really like to ask you some questions inside.
Sir, unless you have a warrant, I said, you can't come in. I know my rights. I've done nothing wrong, and I'm just not comfortable inviting people I don't know into my home, even if they are a cop.
Well, what if I have probable cause? Because I can see you have some marijuana on your coffee table.
I looked over my shoulder. There was, in fact, a pipe on my coffee table. Then I would remind you that it's 2021, and weed is legal in California, I said. Frustrated, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a faded photograph.
Last question. Have you seen this woman?
I squinted. She did seem awfully familiar. Her eyes were so dark it almost seemed like she had no sclera at all. and her messy hair seemed to envelop her narrow shoulders. Though it was merely a photograph, it was like she was looking at me, like sizing me up from her little paper prison. I reached for the photograph to take a closer look, and that's when he grabbed my arm. His fingers were cold and strong, and I noticed for the first time that each one ended in a sharp nail. They dug into my skin, pricking 5 little points of blood. I yanked back with everything I had, stumbling into my apartment, and he stumbled too. But when he hit the threshold, it was like some invisible force knocked him back. He hissed, showing off glinting fangs. Of course, cops, vampires, both need some kind of invitation. He composed himself.
That will be all. Have a good evening.
He quickly walked away from my apartment. I noticed he did not seem to have any patrol car. He was, however, making his way down my block. I rushed to find my phone. My neighbor Linda, she's got a doormat that says, "Come on in."
How to Scare Dad. My father's the scariest man I've ever known, and when armed with a bottle of beer, he reaches nightmare levels. Just the crackle of his belt or rise in words was enough to make me shake like a leaf. One night, while I struggled to get comfortable in bed from the bruises and sounds of my mom crying, I hatched an ingenious idea to stop the pain and suffering. Scare Dad. Clearly, he just didn't know how his actions made us feel, but if I scared him like he scared us, maybe then he would change his ways. I tried anything I could think of to produce some fright and scare Dad straight. I would hide and jump out at him, but he didn't even flinch. I'd place a toy snake in the toilet, but that only resulted in a beating for me. Finally, I thought of destroying his alcohol. I know that people become scared when they lose something they love, so one by one, I poured my dad's bottles down the drain and eagerly awaited his reaction. I knew this would be it. This would be the thing to scare him. That night, I remember my father discovering the empty bottles and becoming angrier than I've ever seen him. I remember him wrecking the house. I remember him storming into my room. I remember his hands around my neck and me seeing black. Luckily, my planning and hard work that night paid off. Today, my father lives in a constant state of fear. I'm always watching him, how timid and nervous he is at all times. Whenever I pay him a visit, his complexion turns pasty white, his body shivers like I used to, and he breaks into a cold sweat. I scared my father so good, you would think he saw a ghost.
That concludes this week's session at the Nightmare Lab. If you enjoyed this episode, click the like button and comment below. If you have your own twisted tale that you'd like narrated on our channel, submit it through the form in the description. Become a part of our sinister collective by subscribing. Be here next week for another concoction to feed the nightmare.